What's up, Highlanders? Welcome back to the workshop. It's your host, Frank. Forgive me if I sound a little annoyed today, but I need to get something off my chest, and that is a state of the game opinion related to an element of the game that I feel has gotten way out of hand, and that is treasures. Now, for a little context, treasure tokens first appeared in Magic back in the original Ixalan block of 2017. Before that, there were a few cards that created gold tokens, which are very similar to treasure tokens, except for the fact that you don't have to tap a gold token to sacrifice it, which actually makes it even more powerful than treasure. So thank goodness they didn't just keep printing gold in the manner that they printed treasure. Otherwise, there would be even less that you could do about it. So maybe they saw treasure as the nerfed version of gold, and that's why they went so wild with it. But they have gone wild with it. Since 2017, 261 unique cards have been printed that either create treasure tokens or interact with them by name. And all of these cards, except for one, Hull Breacher, who was banned a little while back, are illegal in Commander. So 260 treasure related cards. For some perspective, that's more than all of the cards in the history of Magic that create Saproling tokens, which, believe it or not, is only 87 all time. And then if we compare that to the other more recent, I guess you could call them utility artifact tokens, that would be clues and foods. There's actually more treasure related cards than there are food and clue cards combined. Clues, which have actually been around even longer than treasures, they originally debuted back in the second Innistrad block, a few sets before Ixalan came out. There's only 45 cards in Magic that create or interact with clues, and there's 115 that create or interact with food tokens. So there's 100 more treasure cards out there than there are clue cards and food cards combined. That's just a little perspective. Now, why am I bringing this to light? I think this is very much a state of the game discussion that gets more big picture than just do you or do you not like or approve of treasures as a game strategy. It's affected the format in a way that I think Wizards seems to be trying to drive the format anyway, and that is trying to speed the game up, trying to speed the format of Commander up. I've noticed a big difference in the way newer Commander players and old school EDH players view the game. You know, I've been playing EDH since 2011, and I feel like back then it was pretty understood that your average game of EDH was going to be 2 or 3 hours long. And for the most part, we were pretty fine with that. However, I've noticed a lot of players that have started playing in the last 4 or 5 years or less that seem to feel that anything over an hour, hour and a half is just too long. And it seems to me that Wizards is really trying to cater to those newer players and speed the format up as a result. So Exhibit A would be this treasure phenomenon, because treasures, although they are only a temporary mana boost, undeniably speed the game up. Sometimes the temporary mana boost is all you need to get ahead of your opponents and stay there. One round with a pile of treasures that equals or even exceeds you or any other opponent's mana base in the game is like taking extra turns, essentially. Gives you an entire extra turn's worth of mana. Now, again, that doesn't stick around, but neither does an extra turn. You know, it's like a one time thing. But what does stick around is the advantage you've gained from that one time boost. Whether it was ramping more, developing your board, or hindering your opponents, that advantage remains. So is this a problem or not? Well, that kind of depends on where you fall along those lines. Like I said, if you're a newer player, this might be the only environment you've ever known for Commander. And so it's par for the course, and it's totally understandable. And you might well appreciate the fact that you won't typically be stuck in a game for longer than an hour and a half or 2 hours at most. If that's the way you feel, well, then maybe this is not as big of a deal. But aside from the speed of the game, just generally speaking, treasure is an element of the game that has very, very much taken over, or at least strongly redefined the format. But look, I'm not here to just complain. I'm not trying to sit here and just be the old man griping about how things are nowadays and you damn kids and all that stuff. So let's be proactive. Let's talk about what we can do to mitigate that problem, because that's the beautiful thing about Magic the Gathering. No matter what you're doing in your deck, there's something out there that shuts it down. There's a counter to basically every strategy, and so that's what we need to combat that with. Sitting around and whining and complaining and getting salty when someone slams a smothering tithe and outraces the entire table might feel nice, might give you a nice little opportunity to vent, but it's ultimately not going to solve the problem. Something else to consider about treasure decks. Not only do you get the mana production that treasures offer you, but now there are tons of cards that give you benefits for having a lot of artifacts in play, or give you benefits for sacrificing artifacts or sacrificing permanents, things like that. Treasures have a lot of usage and utility beyond just their own innate abilities. So, how do we combat this? Well, let's start with some cards that make treasures straight up unusable. This would be cards like Null Rod and Collector Oof, cards that completely shut off activated abilities of all artifacts. And then we've got March of the Machines and Titania Song, two enchantments that turn all artifacts on the battlefield into creatures that have power and toughness equal to their mana value. So, of course, they can sacrifice the treasures in response to you playing these enchantments and get one more opportunity to use them. But as long as those enchantments sit on the battlefield, any new treasures that would be created are completely useless because they would die instantly. Because of the way state based effects work in Magic, there's no window of opportunity between creating those treasure tokens and when they become 0/0 creatures where you will have an opportunity to sacrifice them before they die. As soon as they enter the battlefield, the state based effects will check these enchantments and say that these treasures are not only artifacts but also 0/0 creatures. That 0 toughness will check, they will die, and there will be no opportunity to sacrifice a treasure that is already on its way to the graveyard. And then finally, there's Yasharn, which, like Null Rod and Collector Oof, essentially turns off the activation ability because Yasharn says that your opponents can't sacrifice things as a means of activating abilities. So these are cards that just completely shut treasures off. Now, let's give an honorable mention here to some cards that at least stall out these treasure strategies. These would be mostly cards like Frozen Aether, Kismet, Blind Obedience, Loxodon Gatekeeper, Manglehorn, and Root Maze, things that have artifacts enter the battlefield tapped. And since you have to tap the treasure to sacrifice it, it forces your opponents to wait an extra round before they can sacrifice their treasures for mana. Now, these all sound great, but they're not entirely foolproof in terms of shutting down a treasure deck. Like I said, there's a lot more you can do with treasures than just sacrificing them for mana. For example, any treasure deck with red is very likely to be running something like Reckless Fireweaver, and even if you prevent your opponent from being able to activate their treasure tokens, or even if you make it to where their treasure tokens die as soon as they're created, they will still trigger the Reckless Fireweaver just by virtue of entering the battlefield. But if your intention is to at least negate the considerable mana advantage that treasure tokens provide, then the previously mentioned cards can definitely help accomplish this for you. Now, in addition to quote unquote shutting off treasure tokens, there are other means to slow down your opponents that are trying to build up huge treasure stockpiles. And that would obviously be anything that can remove the treasures. Now, I'm not going to go through all the things that do it at sorcery speed, things like Vandal Blast that can just destroy all artifacts. That's fine, but it still does give your opponent an opportunity to sacrifice the treasures and create the mana. And if they have something to do at instant speed, they can do it on your turn. What I really want to focus on in this section are cards that will force your opponents to sacrifice their treasures or let them be destroyed at a much more inopportune time. For example, an opponent might tap out or come close to tapping out to create a bunch of treasure tokens, figuring that once they pass the turnaround, if they need mana on opponents' turns, they'll have the treasure tokens there to give it to them. So, something slick that you can do is use the handful of instants out there that can force your opponents to crack their treasure tokens. Like, for example, when they go to end step, they're out of their main phase, no more sorcery speed casting. You can cast a card like Filter Out or Hurkyl's Recall And there's also Hercule's Final Meditation if you want to pay 10 mana, and also Rebuild. These are cards that you can put your opponent in a really tough spot with if they are going to be very reliant on that treasure mana to keep them safe for the rest of the round until their next turn. I'll give an honorable mention here to an old enchantment called Eye of Singularity as well. This does still allow them to get the mana out of the treasure tokens because it says when it enters the battlefield, they have to sacrifice. That's a triggered ability, and so they can sacrifice the treasures for mana with the triggered ability on the stack. And then its continuing effect still allows that window because it says whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, you destroy all other permanents with the same name as that permanent. It still is an ETB effect that gives a round of priority for your opponents to be able to sacrifice the treasures for mana. So even though Eye of Singularity will not allow your opponents to sit on a pile of treasure, they can still create their treasure and sacrifice it for mana on their own turn to cast sorcery speed things. So it's not a total shutdown, but it does greatly hamper their ability to enjoy the full benefits of being able to just sit on a pile of treasure and use it whenever you see fit. Then finally, we have a nice handful of cards that we can use to actively punish our opponents for having or using their treasure tokens. This would be cards like Mayhem Devil, Haunting Wind, and Disciple of the Vault that allow you to dish out some damage when your opponents use their treasures. Then you've got Viridian Revel, which draws you a card every time an opponent uses a treasure. And finally, Ancient Runes, an enchantment that will punish your opponents for trying to sit on a pile of treasure for an extended period of time. Now, there's no perfect way to stop these treasure decks, as I highlighted, because there's just so many different ways that the decks get functionality out of the treasure. Like I said, even if you prevent them from being able to actually sacrifice their treasures with a collector oof or something like that, they're still getting benefits from cards that reward them or harm their opponents for putting lots of artifacts onto the battlefield or just having lots of artifacts on the battlefield. They don't necessarily need to be able to activate their treasures to reap the rewards of having them. And then, of course, these cards have to sit on the battlefield to maintain their effect. So as soon as your opponent can get rid of them, then it's game on. And in the meantime, Collector Oof and Null Rod don't stop your opponents from accumulating treasure. It only stops them from using it. So once the Oof is off the board, then it's go time. There is one new card that I want to give a mention to as well that kind of demonstrates to me that maybe Wizards recognizes that they need some more stuff to kind of stem the tide of the treasure overload that they've been implementing on us for the last few years. And that is a common from Lost Caverns of Ixalan called Dauntless Dismantler. It's a 2-mana 1/4 creature that makes all your opponent's artifacts enter the battlefield tapped, and also lets you pay a white and XX to sacrifice the Dauntless Dismantler and destroy each artifact with mana value X. This is obviously geared directly at treasure because treasures have a mana value of 0, which means if all you want to do is blow up every treasure on the battlefield, you only have to pay 1 white and sacrifice the Dismantler. So that's good. At least they printed one card in the common slot, no less, that is clearly directed towards mitigating dealing with treasure strategies. So all I can say to Wizards here is thank you and keep it coming. And maybe slow down on the treasure cards for a little bit. I think we've had more than enough printed in the last 7 years to last us for a little while. Let's maybe try to focus on something else for a minute. Just seems like every set they come out with, they've got an excuse to squeeze some kind of a treasure token element in there, even if it's just 1 or 2 cards. I think I speak for a lot of EDH players when I say maybe we can give it a rest at this point. Anyway, I'm going to get off my soapbox now. Thank you all for listening to me. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Are you a fan of all this treasure stuff? Are you a fan of the format speeding up in general? Do you like fast games? Do you like long games? We're not even going to get into the topic of CEDH. I know those are rapid games. That's kind of expected. But as a casual Commander player, where do you fall in this argument? Like I said, I'm kind of old school. I'm comfortable with the idea of a 2 to 3 hour game. I don't like a casual game to be lightning fast. I don't mind an hour-long game, but as a seasoned casual, I would say that I rather enjoy a kind of slow early game and a lengthy mid game because that is where the most interesting and exciting stuff happens. But the beauty of this game is that there are so many different ways to have fun with it. Not everyone's going to agree all the time, but that's why you play the game. It's a competition, it's a creative outlet, and it is a means to impose your will, so to speak, on your opponents in the form of the strategies you employ and the cards that you use, to where you can, to a degree, dictate your own experience, which is great. Anyway, slash and rant. If you found this discussion interesting, give me a like, give me a subscribe. It's a new channel. We're trying to grow things here. I want lively and vibrant discussions, so get down in the comments. Tell me I'm an idiot. Tell me I'm a dinosaur if you disagree with what I've said here today, or give me a little love and give me a little support if we're of similar mind. Thanks for stopping by the workshop, and I'll catch you guys next time.